That was quite a song. You could spend a lot of Sundays unpacking that thing. Woo! But you know, in my next life, I want a voice like Andy's. I want to be a jazz singer. I want to be an athlete. Jane gave me a few singing lessons. She thinks I've got it. She's saying, like, I don't know, Jane. How about in my next life, I want to be 6 feet tall? In your next life, you want what? What was that? You guys are quiet this morning.
To be better at housekeeping.
To be better at housekeeping. All right. Anybody want to be worse at it? How many of you have actually ever used the phrase, in my next life? Anybody ever? Oh, okay, a lot of people, all right. How about deja vu? Have you ever had that experience? I think that's pretty universal. Sometimes people experience deja vu that's so powerful and compelling, they think it must be a memory from a past life resurfacing. How about the phrase old soul? Have you ever met a baby or a child who you felt had an old soul? Yeah, I see a lot of heads nodding. Or maybe even an animal who did. Yeah. If you say that they have an old soul, of course you're implying that that soul has lived longer than we would be inclined to give it credit for. Lots of us have spoken as though we believe in reincarnation. So I wonder how many here would say they think reincarnation might be real? Anybody? A sprinkling. Anybody willing to say they definitely think it's real? Yeah, okay, handful. You know, the branches of this congregation in Edgewood, Socorro, and Carlsbad are such small groups, I've probably just outed somebody who was probably the only one that raised their hand. It's okay, friend. You're in good company. Maybe your next life you can hang out with the others who are here. Yeah. There's no official UU statement on reincarnation. We leave room for the possibility of it as a denomination, and apparently a lot of other Americans do too. Actually, all of you who raised your hand, and those of you who should have, but you're too shy, are in good company. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, a reputable research institution, did a study in 2009, and they found that about 1 in every 4 Americans believes in reincarnation. And you can't chalk it up just to religious diversity either. It isn't Hindus and Buddhists who are throwing those numbers. The study showed that 22% of Christians believe people will be reborn again and again. And if you break that number down further, you find that 1 in 10 evangelical Christians believes in it. 25% of mainline Protestants, that's the Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, etc., 25% of them believe in it. 25% of white Catholics, now they're starting to tease it apart by racial identification, and 29% of black Protestants. 25% of people who are unaffiliated with any religion also believe in reincarnation. Isn't that fascinating? That's interesting, right? I mean, we see reincarnation in movies and in novels, but I haven't heard any serious dinner conversations about this. It's rarely to never mentioned at funerals and memorial services, and yet 1/4 of America, and a bunch of us, believe that some essential self stays intact through the death process and is reborn. Most of us, though, have a pretty foggy notion of what exactly that would entail. Although some religious traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, have specific teachings about how reincarnation works, most Americans who belong to other religious traditions or to no religion are not familiar with those teachings and might even be surprised about how specific they are. The Pew Forum report suggests that the reason so many Protestants and Catholics believe in reincarnation is that they're just mixing faith traditions. The report says that in that milieu, Eastern and New Age beliefs are widespread, are popular for mixing in. However, there are sects within all of the world's major religions that explicitly believe in reincarnation, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It's just outside the mainstream of those faiths. So it seems a large percentage of people, about a quarter, keep that belief quietly to themselves. It's funny that it seems so surprising or controversial when it's such an old and now apparently widespread idea. We humans have been thinking about death and rebirth for a very long time. And as Voltaire pointed out, is it really more surprising to be born twice than once? In Hinduism, the earliest Hindu sacred text, the Rig Veda, was composed around 1000 BCE. It regards death as part of an inevitable part of chaos, something to be avoided for as long as possible. It doesn't talk about reincarnation, but it contains vague images of an afterlife. About 100 years later, the Brahmanas were written, and they hint at a future doctrine of rebirth, probably not on Earth, but in some other realm. And now, rebirth and reincarnation are different. Rebirth means being born into another life of some kind, including possibly as a spiritual being, maybe in another world, while reincarnation means being born into an earthly body. The word reincarnate comes from the Latin incarnare, which means to make flesh. The Brahmanas only hint at rebirth, but, and this is interesting, they definitely speak of recurring death. So they've got the recurring death, but not necessarily rebirth. The phrase recurring death or re-death is important to understanding Hindu philosophies of reincarnation. Westerners tend to think of the idea of reincarnation as a pleasant idea, something that eases the pain of death or regret by holding out the promise of being born again. However, the ultimate goal in a major school of Hinduism, and Buddhism too, is to attain freedom, moksha in Hinduism, nirvana in Buddhism, freedom from the cycles of birth and death, especially from re-death, from dying over and over again, because re-death is not just physical, but has to do with the repeated loss of happiness in life. The Upanishads are the next major Hindu text and are written as a series of conversations. They started to be composed around 700 BCE. They also speak first of re-death, but then they do finally explicitly talk about rebirth. An early Upanishad envisions that some people will want to be freed from the cycle of reincarnation, while others will choose to be reborn. And this choice, these two tracks, continue today in Hinduism as options. Later texts flesh out the implications of the theory of karma, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. Hinduism also contains the concepts of heaven and hell, which preceded the idea of rebirth. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, how do heaven and hell combine with reincarnation? I'll tell you how. Heaven and hell are intermediate states in Hinduism. Wendy Doniger, who's a scholar of Hinduism at the University of Chicago, explains. She says, after death, the reincarnating soul takes one of two paths. If good karma predominates over bad karma, the soul goes first to hell for a relatively brief period, where it works out or consumes any bad karma by being tormented, and then to heaven for a long period where it enjoys the fruits of good karma. If bad karma predominates, the soul goes first briefly to heaven, and then for a longer sojourn in hell. In either case, the two sorts of karma are consumed, and after that, the soul is reborn in a station in life determined by the original balance of good and bad karma. I told you it was specific. Another Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, likens the process of dying and being reborn to a change of clothes. Just as a certain combination of clothing is not identical with its wearer, the body is not identical with the self. In fact, the essential self wears three garments in Hinduism: the physical body, which we can see, the subtle body, which is the invisible repository of karma, it's where your karma is collected, and the causal body. The causal body is harder to conceptualize. It's finer than the subtle body. But in relation to these three garments, the true essence of a person, the Atman alone, is unchanging. It is the knower. When death occurs, the subtle body separates from the physical body, eventually shutting the physical body down. Hinduism is a rich and colorful tradition with countless stories and scriptures, and there are so many and so many interpretations of them that it almost seems hopeless to try to sum it up in a sermon. So this is a snapshot of some key concepts, but is by no means intended to reflect the beliefs of a specific Hindu person. So we have to remember that, and we'll be doing the same thing with Buddhism. Around the time the Upanishads were being composed, Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, who the world knows as the Buddha, was also born. Like Jesus, who was born a Jew and whose life would later be seen as the beginning of a new religion, the Buddha was born a Hindu. The Buddhist tradition that followed from his life and teachings has much in common with Hinduism, but not everything. Buddhism looks around the universe and sees one truth: change. Everything exists in an interdependent web of fleeting moments that constantly transform and reproduce themselves. There are no constants, not even a permanent mental essence that we might call a soul. In Buddhism, this is known as the concept of no self. There are many varieties of Buddhism, and they don't all agree with each other, so I'm going to just zoom in on one, and that's Tibetan Buddhism, and specifically the perspective put forth in Sogyal Rinpoche's excellently written book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. If you're interested in delving more deeply into a philosophy of reincarnation, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying is a very good place to start. You won't be able to put it down. According to Rinpoche, two aspects of our being are revealed at death: our absolute nature and our relative nature. Our relative nature is reflected in questions like, how have you lived your life? What kind of person have you been? Did you help or hurt others? When people who have had near-death experiences report reliving or witnessing an accounting of their whole lives, they're experiencing the reconciling of their relative nature. In the death process, the components of the body and mind disintegrate, eventually lifting away everything. Eventually, Rinpoche says, all distractions and negative feelings are gone, and we are left with what he calls the primordial ground of our absolute nature, which is like a pure and cloudless sky. He goes on, this is called the dawning of the ground luminosity, or clear light, where consciousness itself dissolves into the all-encompassing space of truth. For the spiritually disciplined and well-trained person, it's an opportunity for liberation from those cycles of rebirth and death. But the rest of us are unlikely to recognize it. After death, the enlightened person may linger in that state of ground luminosity. The unenlightened person will slip into unconsciousness, where they will stay for up to 3 days, during which Tibetan Buddhists try very hard not to disturb the deceased person's body. It's thought that disturbing the body can lead to an unfortunate reincarnation. For most people, the dissolution, the dissolving that led to the state of the ground luminosity then begins to reverse itself. And though the physical body no longer lives, the deceased person returns to his or her mind body. They may not realize death has occurred. They may wander around, trying to visit their home or talk to people who cannot see them. This intermediate state, which is called a bardo, continues until we can make a karmic connection with our future parents. Although karma sweeps us towards certain rebirths, Rinpoche says there are certain signs and visions we can watch out for during this phase that will give us clues about where we're headed. And there are some things we can do to achieve a higher birth than we otherwise might, such as praying and meditating. At the moment your new physical body is conceived, your mind-body dissolves again, returning you to the ground luminosity. The intermediate state is over. Your new life begins with the luminosity, just as your old one ended with it. And you forget. Now, a word about karma. You will have deduced by now that karma is not what we would like to think it is a lot of the time. As much as we wish it were true, there's no instant karma, even though sometimes it really looks like there is. Last month, a guy in New York City groped a woman on the street, and then as he was running away, dropped straight down into an open manhole. He was fished out by police. Poetic justice? You betcha. Karma? Afraid not. According to Rinpoche, there are different kinds of karma, including karma for individuals, cities, nations. And the true concept can only be grasped by an enlightened being. But in its simplest terms, we can say that karma is the idea that everything we do, whether it's with our bodies, minds, or speech, has a corresponding result. Usually it takes so long for the result to play out or mature that we don't see the connection anymore. Karma plays out not just across one lifetime, but across many. When we think of reincarnation, we tend to imagine that the self or the soul is like a thread that passes through the sequence of lives, linking them together like a strand of beads. In Buddhism, the relationship between the lives is not like a strand of beads, it's more like a stack of blocks. Each block depends on the one beneath it, but it's separate. The relationship is one of causality, and the nature of that causality is determined by karma. Each lifetime is kind of a basis for the next. After the advent of Buddhism and in other parts of the world, reincarnation continued to be a subject of reflection and debate. The Greeks called it metempsychosis. Druids believed in it too. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells Nicodemus that no one will enter heaven who is not born again. Nicodemus asks him if he means we must be born from our same mothers again, because how would that be possible, he asks. And Jesus' enigmatic reply seems to indicate that we are reborn in spiritual bodies. Reborn, not reincarnated, no bodies, but still, there was speculation even after that. The early Christian church father Origen, who was one of our universalist ancestors we often mention, he believed in and taught reincarnation. That belief was soon excluded from the Christian church, though, in favor of the pure doctrines of heaven and hell, and the idea that the righteous will not be reborn at all, but resurrected like Jesus. Now, when we hear the phrase born again in a Christian context, it sounds more like changing our minds than changing our earthly garments. But it wasn't always so straightforward. And what, if anything, could modern science have to say about reincarnation? Well, there's certainly no evidence that such a thing exists. There are intriguing stories of near-death experiences that seem to have a lot in common, both with each other and with ancient philosophies of reincarnation. But then again, humans have been having near-death experiences probably since long before they started doing any philosophizing. And philosophy is drawn from human experience, so maybe it's not so surprising if they align. I'm not sure you can conclude too much from that. Taking a scientific view of the body as matter, we could speak of the cycling of elements. We know, factually speaking, that we humans are made of the same things as the world around us. Energy bound up into atoms, atoms bound up into molecules, bound up into elements. They come together as you, as me, and we exist. They dissolve again and we have died, but all that we were physically made of is still there. It's just becoming something new. I imagine it like a drop of water returning to the ocean from the sky. What about consciousness? We don't know as much about that. There's the psychological self, the part of you that says, I, made up of memories and narrative and relationships. It dances with biological urges. The psychological self is very bound up with the physical self in some ways. We know this from brain science. And anyone who's ever experienced or who has witnessed someone else experiencing clinical depression or other mental health issues or a brain injury knows this well. That's most of us. Most of us have seen that in some way. Much of what we think of as the self seems to be bound up with biology, but is there something more? Some energy or spark of life that's more than hard wiring? If so, it would make sense to me that it should also follow the same rules, merging back into the all, not disappearing. not going from being to non-being. When who and what we are is merged back with the all and something new is born, in what way does that self continue? Certainly there are intangible ways, non-incarnated ways, like we continue through the effect we've had on the world, through the people we've loved and the actions we've taken and all the things we've set in motion. But maybe there are incarnated ways too. I tend to think there may be. I'll raise my hand now. There is something I'm wary about, though, and that's the idea that we may be born into the situation we deserve, that we deserve whatever we get as our lot in life. Some people take the idea of karma and they arrive at that conclusion. The same thing can happen with the New Age idea that we manifest our reality with our thoughts. It's a little bit true, but karma and thoughts are only parts of a larger picture. We know a worthwhile religious belief by its fruits. If a person's version of karma and reincarnation leads them to behave as though anyone born into unfortunate circumstances somehow deserves their lot, then the fruits of their faith are abandonment and indifference, and those are not pretty. And of course, if you don't help someone who's suffering because you think it's their karma to suffer, you're probably failing to notice what that does to your own karma. So, we should take to heart Sogyal Rinpoche's admonition that only an enlightened being can truly understand the whole truth of it, and we should seek always to do what we can. We should practice compassion, which is the teaching of all the world's religions in the form of the Golden Rule. Unitarian Universalism may leave the door open on reincarnation and other theological concepts, but there's one idea we won't budge on, and that's the conviction that this life matters. It's a gift that lends itself beautifully to tradition, to science, to your wildest imaginings, and to the yearnings of your soul. Doesn't it? Closing song.